I would suggest doing things that have a deadline, or setting a deadline for yourself and making it public so that people keep you honest, or that sort of thing. That really helps me, knowing I need this thing done by X. It pushes me to finish. And it's taken a long while for me to realize that it doesn't need to be perfect either, because perfection is the enemy of completion.
Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I am Gary Snow, and joining me today is Nathan Russel. Nathan is the person behind Peril Games and the creator of the minimalist game system Freeform Universal, which has inspired Nathan's later game design such as Neon City Overdrive and the most recent release, Hard City, which you can see here. And we're going to talk about all those games and his design career. But first of all, Nathan, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good. And you might be able to tell from home that there's a slight accent there. So Nathan, where are you coming from today?
I am in Newcastle, Australia, which is just a couple of hours north of Sydney. So that's where I have spent the better part of my adult life. And I like to sometimes call it my fortress of solitude. It's, I've got plenty of people to play games with, but I sort of sometimes feel a bit detached from sort of the game design community, which tends to be closer to our major centres like Sydney and Melbourne and that sort of thing.
So, speaking of that exact topic, how did you get started in gaming? What kind of a hotbed is gaming in Australia?
It's very active. We have a great gaming community and have had for a very long time. My beginnings were in high school, as a lot of people's were, and it sort of started a bit, I think, differently to a lot of people. I made some new friends when I started high school, so I was about 12 or so, and they were really into computer games and coding and creating their own games. And one of them had run across a book that had made reference to these strange pen and paper games that were played with grid maps and stuff like that. And knowing nothing more than that, and having a copy of a fighting fantasy book, which is the sort of choose your own adventure style games, they made up their own game. And we all played it and loved it. And eventually we found Redbox D&D and fell into it that way. Found some older guys that were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and a whole host of board games. We played a lot of BattleTech and things like that. And so that was sort of the beginnings. And I think that experience shaped my desire to sort of design games a lot, because from the very beginning we were making it up as we went along and that sort of thing. So that's where we started, and played vigorously throughout high school. When I went away to university, it sort of dropped off a little bit. I was a theatre major. I focused more on performance and things like that, and then later, when time became a little shorter for constant rehearsals and things like that, I fell back into gaming. I got a job at Games Workshop, and so worked there for a few years as in the store and running games and painting models and things like that. And yeah, so that's sort of a very small sort of snapshot of where I began in games. So yeah.
And you said you're a theater major. How much did that inform, now looking back upon it, how much did that inform the way you design your games?
I think massively. I think that my interest in character and story and telling stories in interesting ways and delving into the characters and being the characters, I think, is really important to the sorts of games I like to play. I think that certainly affects the sorts of games that I lean towards when I play games or when I write games and that sort of thing. So it definitely had a very big influence on what I do now and what I've enjoyed most in the past. So yeah.
And are you like the forever GM because of that? Or are you like, where do you normally sit at the game table?
I'm pretty lucky. So I get to play as much as I get to run. So usually what I play is Dungeons and Dragons, because one of my closest friends, that's his game, that's what he loves, and so we play that. And so I play on a fairly regular basis. But then I'll pull out a weird game or one of my own games or that sort of thing, and we'll mix it up and that sort of thing. We've got a big group of a big community, and so we fall into little patches, into little groups, and some of us will play D&D, and then another group of us will play test one of my games or crack out Fiasco or that sort of thing. So I'm pretty lucky in that regard in terms of having the opportunity to both play and run games. So yeah.
And speaking of Fiasco, which is like kind of an improv minimalist game, you I believe started your career, and I'm going to bring it up here with let's go back to the original slide here of Freeform Universal role-playing game. And I have the classic rules up here. And what edition are you at now? Is there...
That is still the current edition. There is a beta for a second edition available on my website, and it's been sitting there. The beta has been sitting there untouched for a couple of years now. It just things have sort of stacked up, and sort of it's on a list of things for me to finish off. So Freeform Universal. Fu is how I pronounce it. FU is how other people enjoy pronouncing it. But I released that in 2010. I'd written some other games prior to that, and had done a fair bit of 24-hour game design contests. So sort of the precursor of today's modern game jams. So I was relatively active on forums such as 1KM 1KT, which was a forum of game designers that would regularly run contests over a weekend to design games on specific themes and things like that. I participated in events and activities and things on The Forge, which was very big in the early to mid 2000s. And Freeform Universal came out of that eventually. I actually wrote the core mechanic of the game, the yes, no, and but, back in 2004, when I was introducing a friend to role-playing. So Rowan had heard of Dungeons and Dragons, knew I was a role player, had an interest in it, but no idea where to start. And I didn't want to begin with 3 big hardcover books and several hours of game creation and explaining modifiers. What I really wanted to show him was it's about being a character and doing things that are fun or exciting. So I'd whipped up a very basic game where you played goblins in a labyrinth. It was very much the film Labyrinth without the humans, and we played that, and I used that core game mechanic in Freeform Universal, which was written over the course of a weekend, and it's sort of, I don't know why it's sort of hung around for so long. I wrote it, I put it together, I put it out there, first of all on the forums, and then published on RPG Now. And some people really liked it, which was a very, very pleasant surprise. It's a super simple system. The classic rules are simply you roll a dice and you look at the result. And in those particular rules, even numbers are good, odd numbers are bad. So because I just decided to call the system Beating the Odds and lent into it, now my preference is to go high numbers are good, low numbers are bad. It's just easier for our brains, I think. But the basic system is you roll a die. A 6 is a really good success, which we call a yes and. Yes, you do the thing and you do something else. And everything's framed in questions. So when a character wants to do something, you ask a question. Can I leap over that large gap in the between 2 buildings? Or can I hit the orc with my sword? You roll the dice and you get a yes or no response. And you can see there the table on the screen. It runs from yes and, yes, yes, but, no, or no and. And I just found those are enough of a prompt for you to continue telling the story. So you talk at the table, you play the game, you hit a point where I'm not sure if my character can do it. Let's ask a question. And then we discover, oh, yes, I can, but something has happened along the way, or whichever result you end up with.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to like now place it into the whole timeline of
Yep.
like game development, and I mean, Powered by the Apocalypse uses the similar kind of mechanic, and so was that just something that was floating around, or are you the perhaps first person to have used that? I'm not too
I
sure.
don't know. So I can't even remember when Powered by the Apocalypse came out. It must have been around a similar time. But yeah, as I said, the core yes, no, and but is from 2004, and then I wrote this in 2010. I certainly have always paid attention to what else is happening in the indie game design space, and I think that uh, certainly there's no doubt that there's cross-pollination, and I've certainly been influenced in huge ways by games like PBTA and things like that in my later games that I didn't see it at the time, and then when it was pointed out, it's like, oh yeah, really obviously there's elements of Blades in the Dark and things like that in some of my later designs as well. So yeah.
So how many games? Well, first of all, I'll note that it's Creative Commons by 4.0, which means a lot of people can use this as the baseline of their game, just giving
Absolutely.
credit and from it. But with the OGL stuff and all that kind of stuff, I have to ask: do you know how many games have used the? Well, I want to say FU. I'll try not to say FU.
You can say it. It's fine.
It's just the way I always say it. But how many? Do you ever regret that name, or has that anybody ever kind of said, "Well, why did you name it that?" Or like anything like?
Look, I haven't regretted it. No. And I think it was no doubt in the back of my mind when I first did it that I was literally writing it in 24 hours, and who knows what goes through your brain in that condensed amount of time as you bang out 24 pages of text. Where originally, because Freeform Universal was certainly also playing off game names like GURPS and TWERPs, and so originally I was going to call it something like FERPs or Ferg or something like that, and then I just kept the first two letters. So yeah, I don't regret it, and I don't care what people call it. I certainly occasionally I'll get the odd comment, well, that's just rude. You should change the name. And
well, it's like, memorable, right?
So that's right.
You don't forget
it. Yeah. In regards to how many games have been based off it, I don't know. There's been some very memorable things that I know. Very early on, before I released it as Creative Commons, I was contacted by Carsten Dam, who works with Vagrant Workshop, which is a game design company in Germany, I think. And he wanted to use it for some of his games. And it was used, and in order to just avoid needing contracts and crazy stuff, which I really don't have time to deal with, I was like, let's just make it Creative Commons. By that stage, Fate was released as a Creative Commons by license, I think, as well. And so I released that, and Carsten and the Vagrant Workshop crew went on to use it as the core rules for their Earthdawn RPG that they did. So Earthdawn Age of Legends. And they used it as well for another fancy hardback science fiction game they had. So for people watching on video, Earthdawn Age of Legends is essentially the setting of the classic Earthdawn RPG, but uses the Freeform Universal rules with some tweaks and additions to cover the magic and things like that was required. And that gave me a huge boost in confidence that, oh yeah, I must have something that I've written that people like and that sort of thing. I know that it's been used for French game that was based on a series of novels. There's been lots of translation work, so Italian and Polish and French, and I think probably German and things like that as well. So Brazilian. So there's lots of variations of it out and about there, and a really strong and friendly community of game designers that have latched onto it and enjoy it and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, and you were like well ahead of your time. Like when I think about where things are at now, where I mean, the focus of the games, where you're like lean into your character, you give a few hooks, and like you lean into the cliches, so to speak, of like
Yeah.
the genre of the person that's in it, and that seems to be like nowadays a lot of games are just like random table, get a character up and running, away
Yeah.
you go, and people really seem to like that. At the time when FU came out, though, was that like still hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around? Because that was still pretty crunchy times.
Yeah. So I think it was certainly much easier to sort of create a character than even games like Fate and things like that. Luckily, the groundwork had been laid by a lot of other really good indie game designers in terms of the using words to describe characters. So Fate had aspects, and I'm sure there's a few others that off the top of my head. So there's the PDQ system by Atomic Sock Monkey Press, who was using words as descriptors, but it had numbers attached to those words and things like that. And Rises, the Rises RPG. So it was certainly something that people familiar with indie games and smaller games were aware of. But I think that sometimes I would explain it to people who were traditionally D&D players or the like, and you could see sort of the wheels turning and their eyes opening and go, I can do anything. And, and that's a really pleasing sort of moment to have with those, no, it doesn't matter. It's not relying on dice rolls or numbers or what the rule book says that you can do. You can, whatever is in your head, that's what you can play as your character. And I think that's my favorite part about games that focus on describing your character.
And when did you make that next step into, okay, you've got the system, and I'm sure you were playing different genres. When did you start kind of making, okay, I'm going to make a specific game that's in a setting?
So it's a long time between drinks, really, I think. I certainly played around and have written a variety of things. And I did a number of hacks of Freeform Universal. So I wrote and released some free 2-page documents so you could play Star Wars type games or The Matrix or things like that. But then for a long while, I sort of fell more into playing around with wargame rules and experimenting with that, mostly because I can be a bit lazy in terms of reading huge rule books and then finding 5 supplements to support what I'm reading and things like that. And so I played around with a variety of different war games, none that really came to much. Same with,
I saw you on your website, which all the links are going to be in the description. So everybody go check it out, Planet Peril Games.
Peril Planet, other
Peril
way
Planet.
around.
Oh, sorry,
that's all right. Look,
the P's.
Yeah, it's a common. People go Peril Planet. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, Danger Planet was already taken. So.
Well, I will make sure we get that right in the description. But you had Gunframe, which was an anime mecha battle game, and then Green and Tan, which was used little plastic toy soldiers that you get in a big bag at the dollar store.
Yep. So I went through a phase where I did a bunch of things aimed at designed for my nephews to play. So my kids were still way too little to really engage and play at any level that was sort of strategic or particularly enjoyable for old me to play. But I had teenage nephews, and so I'd written a role-playing game that sort of looked and felt a bit like D&D, but was much simpler. And I wrote the Green and the Tan so that we could just play with army men. It was super easy, and it was also designed so that they could take it away and go and play with their dads, so that one of my brothers is a gamer, but the other isn't, and so I wanted something that was simple enough that they could go home and keep playing and that sort of thing. So I wrote Green and the Tan. It's super straightforward, just uses D6 and a bag of plastic army men to get through, and that's where that kind of came from. And then Gunframe came out of my desire to play. I've got a lot of miniatures, a lot of mecha miniatures, and I ended up with hundreds of Robotech miniatures after the Robotech Tactics Kickstarter, where it took many years for it to come out, and then the line was dead as on arrival. And so I thought, well, what can I use my Mech Warrior and my Battletech and my Robotech and my Gundam Gashapons and whatever else I have all together. And so I wrote something that was generic enough and flexible enough that I could say, this is what this model represents, and that sort of thing. And there really wasn't a game that I felt emulated the fast pace of anime mecha stories. So when we think about Mech Warrior or Battletech, or any of those other mech games, they're often walking tanks. They're slow and ponderous and that sort of thing. And I wanted something that felt like it was a little bit quicker. And so that's where that grew out of. And I spent a very long time playtesting, mostly with Rowan, who is the gentleman that is the person who I'd originally written the Foo rules for as well. So, and I'm really pleased with the way that particular game came out. Yeah.
Cool. And then you, so after skirmish games, you delved back into the tabletop role-playing games. And
yeah,
what was the first title that? Because I kind of get the sense between like your two kind of, at least for me, your bigger titles of Neon City Overdrive and Hard City now, that you're not stuck in fantasy, which a lot of designers do get very stuck into fantasy, but you did delve in it and play with that for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So my brain seems to run all over the place all the time, and I consume a lot of media, a lot of books and film and TV on all genres, and often I'll go off on binges where I'll just focus on a particular genre of media, and then I'll go, how can I recreate that? How can I play that? And that sort of thing. And so that's why it is an eclectic mix of games and titles and things like that. I'd written a game called the Beast of Linfield, which was a sort of Viking saga-esque game that it uses a completely different system, and it has pre-generated characters. It was very much inspired by Lady Blackbird. So I'm often inspired as well by other game designers and what they're doing, and then thinking, how can I take that little bit of their game and run with it and that sort of thing. And so I loved the way that Lady Blackbird was a self-contained game. It had the characters ready to go. It had a scenario to start, but wasn't restricting you on what to do next. So I put that together. But 2020 rolled around, and we all know that things didn't go the way anybody planned in 2020. I had actually just started 12-month sabbatical from work, and the intention was that we were packing up the family and traveling for 12 months. Traveling for a few months, and then I was going to be at home painting the house. But the world shut down. We were all at home, and all I could think of was, well, at least I'll have the Cyberpunk 2077 video game to keep me occupied. And they just kept pushing that game release back. So I instead sat at my computer and tapped out Neon City Overdrive. I as a kid, Cyberpunk 2020 was one of the games we played a lot, one of the games that I loved. One of my favorite films is Blade Runner. And so that I was super excited for the release of that video game. And when it didn't come, I was like, oh, that's all right. Let's write something. So Neon City Overdrive was an idea that I've had for a very long time. I had I think there is a blog post way back around 2010 where I talked about designing Neon City Overdrive, and my intention was to do a design diary type thing, and it just fizzled out, and I never finished it, and I never created the game. So 2020 was the year that I put that together, and I think that Cyberpunk was 100% in the air in 2020, and so when it released, people reacted really positively to it. So people were enthusiastic about the opportunity to sort of play the kind of Cyberpunk games that they want, because it's a toolbox. It's designed, to be. It's got a hint of a setting in there, but it's broad enough for people to imagine the world in whatever light that they want to. Whether they wanted to, play something that was close to the William Gibson novels, or whether they wanted to play something that was more transhuman, it was broad enough and the details were vague enough that they could use the rules themselves. And it uses the core of the second edition of Foo. So that beta document talks about trademarks and edges and things like that. And so it was also kind of an experiment. I had written and released the second edition beta for Foo, and it's huge. It's over 100 pages and unfinished. And I kind of reached a point where I was like, that's much bigger than the kind of game that I really want to write or play or give out to people. So can I cherry pick the bits of that beta document and apply it to a very specific genre? And that's where the rules for Neon City Overdrive came. And I still love it. There's so many things about Neon City Overdrive that sort of, you can clearly see the influence of my previous games. You can see the influence of other games that sort of have become popular over the last decade, and it remains flexible enough to play whatever style of game. I've run sort of anime police dramas with it. I've seen people have told me they've run very much Akira, post-apocalyptic, weird psychological cyberpunk drama, and obviously all the classic. There's an adventure in the back of the book that's essentially the plot to the Dredd movie, the Judge Dredd movie. So it's wide open, and I think that's what appealed to people about Neon City Overdrive.
And did you was it just through DriveThruRPG that you did that? And did you have the vision and you sought out artists, or did you get stock art for that?
So it's all stock art. So I write and publish very part-time. I have a full-time job, and I come home from work with all the good intentions to do a couple of hours of writing and publishing, and then I fall onto the lounge or spend time with the kids. So I try to keep things as simple as possible. So I wrote the game. I often will write games in layout. So I open up InDesign, I get the look of the book, and I use that to help me sort of stay on target in terms of what the game is about. So I know this is the feel that I want from the game. I'll create a basic design for the book and work out my headers and fonts, and then I'll write straight into that document. It speeds up my process considerably, having now also written games just in Word documents, which I'll talk about in a moment. So it speeds up the process considerably, and then I can see where the gaps are, where the big blank pages are, and then I use stock art that matches the content of those pages to fill in those white spaces.
And do you have a background in graphic design? Like, are you comfortable in InDesign, or did you have to pick that skill up?
That's through practice. And if somebody that was a a professional sat over my shoulder, they would probably grimace a lot. But I've been doing it long enough now that I'm quite comfortable with InDesign and a little bit with Photoshop to fumble my way through and get it done, to the point where I try to switch and
sorry.
No, you're right.
I hit the wrong button. I was trying to get the PDF off it. I'm glad you're still connected, though.
I'm here. Yeah, so I'm quite comfortable with InDesign now, to the point I tried to switch to Affinity Publishing, and it was just different enough that I was like, no, I'll just go back to InDesign at this point. So, and yeah, I think you asked about DriveThruRPG. So up until very recently, up until this month, everything was exclusively through DriveThruRPG, and that was just for simplicity. So I've had an itch.io account for a long time, but this month I've started to put those games up on itch, and I'll start to look at some other places. I used to sell through Lulu. I used to do print on demand through Lulu, but I had some issues and things, and I closed that stuff down. But I'm looking at reopening that so that, just so that there's the opportunity and the option for people.
It's ever evolving, isn't it? And how is it for like I know for DriveThruRPG, like I live in Canada, and there's a Lightning source print that comes from Canada, but I don't know if every country has that. And does Australia have that? Or is it just like wholly expensive for delivery to you?
I think that I have received books from Melbourne, but most of them, I'm pretty sure, indicate the UK. So when I order through print on demand through DriveThru, I think that that's where they're being printed and where they're coming from. And I think from memory that Lightning Source have these hubs over the place, but I don't think, I'm not sure if there's one in Australia or not. So so anything that I order from overseas tends to cost me an arm and a leg in terms of postage. So I'm kind of used to it these days. I think most Australian gamers are well aware that if we need to be prepared to pay the same price as the product in postage usually to get something. So
and you're normally, that makes those decisions a little bit more precious when you say, okay, I'm going to buy that because the cost. Like I always hate that I spend more on delivery than the actual book itself, and so you start to like either save up 8 books that you're waiting to buy.
That's exactly right. I've got a DriveThruRPG account open at the moment with a bunch of print on demand books that I'm keen to get, and I'm like, is there anything else I want before I hit buy on that button? So it's much easier to buy in bulk in that regard. So
and then Hard City, and that's through Osprey Games, which was a deviation from your typical publishing.
Absolutely,
so tell us the story of how this came to be.
That that was sort of a wonderful surprise. So I'm a big fan of Osprey Games. I have a huge collection of their war games, and they started when Osprey, who traditionally do historical books about different military campaigns and historical periods, they a number of years ago began printing war games in these little blue books, and that was fantastic. They were on all kinds of eclectic topics, from fantasy to historical and things like that, and I have a huge collection of them and love them. And then a few years ago, they announced they were doing role-playing games. They were going to start publishing role-playing games. And I had reached out then, and I'm not even sure the editor knows this actually, but I'd reached out then and they said, yeah, sure, send us some ideas. And that reply email got lost in my junk mail, which I didn't discover until fairly recently. And so I thought, oh, they never replied. But
Jerks, eh?
Yeah, I'm like, what? And, but I'd released Neon City Overdrive, and it had obviously, lots of people paid attention to it and thought it was pretty cool. And somebody at Osprey Games had seen it as well. And they reached out to me and said, would you be interested in running something for us? And I said, 100%, yes, I would be. Let's talk. They asked me to pitch some ideas. They had said in their initial contact that after I'd said that they thought a noir type game might actually fit quite well with those rules, and so that was one of the ideas that I'd pitched, and that's the one that we ran with to begin with Hard City, and it was a really interesting experience. So where previously I do it all for myself, more often than not I write games for myself. I write the game that I know I'm going to play and I'm going to enjoy, and then I chuck it out on DriveThruRPG and hope that somebody else is going to get some use out of it. And this time, I don't know, I felt a lot more pressure because somebody else was backing me in this regard. And so it was an interesting experience to write for a publisher in that regard. And I wrote it all as a Word document, which was a very different experience as well. So normally when I get tired of typing the words, I'll play around with layout or design or that sort of thing. So it's a very different experience, and one that I really am, so glad that I've had, because I feel like it's made me a better writer in many ways, but the process has been very time consuming as well. So I wrote Hard City in 2021, so over the course of about 10 months with playtesting and things like that. And then there was the editing and the design process. And Osprey are fantastic, so they sort of work with you as a partner, and so lots of decision making together in terms of art and design and layout and things like that. And it was slated for release October 2022. I think it came out slightly later than that due to distribution issues, which are still ongoing effects of COVID and things like that. I was really excited to do noir because it is a period that and a genre that I'm familiar with, and I have enjoyed in the past, and I think there was a clear connection with my interest in cyberpunk and Blade Runner in particular. Blade Runner is very much informed by that style, and I was aware of that, and so I could see the connection and the crossover between the two games already, and I really enjoyed spending 12 months diving into some books that I hadn't read in a long time, finding new books and new films, and we're very lucky that, first of all, a lot of older material is still available on streaming services. There's also a lot of really good stuff coming out even now that it fits the genre.
Have you seen the new Perry Mason series?
I haven't seen the second season, but
I haven't started the second season yet either, but the first one was great.
It was fantastic, and I watched it as I was making my original notes for Hard City. So it was. I feel that Perry Mason series was quite influential in terms of what I had in my head of what a game would look like. And I refer in the book for Hard City, it suggests some campaign frames that you might use. So you might be reporters, or you might be police, or whatever. And one of them is a suggestion that you work for somebody like a lawyer. And I think that was very much informed by the Perry Mason series. So where you're kind of the people that do the legwork and find all the details, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I saw it listed on Osprey Games, and I think Osprey Games, just from a layperson's point of view, they're still, getting their foothold into the RPG kind of world, I think, but they're really doing a good job, and they're getting out some really good, solid products. But it doesn't sometimes have the cachet as, like a Mothership or something like that, where it's the type of thing. But I remember I saw this and I was like, I'm super interested in it. And I almost ordered it online, and then it just happened to be in my local game store.
Oh wow.
And I immediately went, okay, I'm going to buy it. But the benefit of Osprey, I'm assuming, is their wide reach, and they have distribution with so many game stores all over the world already.
Yeah, that's right. They are part of a huge publishing company. So their distribution channels, I think, are, reach every corner of the world and every nook and cranny and that sort of thing. So, as well as, I'm pretty sure that the PDFs and ebooks are available on the same places that I sell, like DriveThruRPG, but they can get into those bookshops, they can get into those game stores and things like that, and they have that power to distribute worldwide. So, which is wonderful. It's an opportunity for me to show my games to people that probably would never have seen them at all otherwise. So, which is one of the other reasons why I was like, yes, please, let me write something for you.
And they are a solid company that's been around for like a long time, and I'm really happy they're into tabletop role-playing games now, because it's a nice voice. And like I said, it might not have the I don't know, I'm not trying to say that, because I love this game, and I'm not trying to say it doesn't have the cool factor, but
I know exactly what you mean. It doesn't have that sort of, yes, whatever it is that people get crazy excited about. So,
but solid games, and I thought Heart City was really good, and you could see the DNA of FU in it,
all the way
and
through.
so it's nice that you kind of found your groove, so to speak. Like, everything's kind of working out nice for you. And so you've got, if I can see this now, you got Neon City Overdrive.
Yep.
You've got Heart City. And what makes perfect sense is to do another city book. Tell us about that.
All right. Well, I have another book coming from Osprey called Tomorrow City, and it is a diesel punk adventure game. Basically, it's I'm not sure how much I can say, but it is heavily inspired for me by the genre of diesel punk, which is interwar period, weird technology. It's still sort of very much sort of set in that 30s look of fedoras and things like that, but with a veil of science fiction and grime over the top of it. I was inspired by some of the books that I love, like 1984 and Brave New World, in terms of developing the background. So there is a sinister undertone in terms of the background, but it will be flexible enough for you to run the gamut from dystopian diesel punk through to the Rocketeer. And so I had a lot of fun with that particular book, and I hope people enjoy it. It's got a lot more background detail than any of my previous releases. It's got a lot more world building and things baked right into it to sort of, so that people could see the vision of the world that I have in mind. It uses the same system, but with some tweaks. And so I'm keen to see how people feel about those differences and those changes. So I feel it's a crunchier version of the Neon City Overdrive rules, but still has the same ease of character generation and the same dice mechanic and that sort of thing. So I'm really looking forward. I've seen some of the artwork. I've had some good feedback from the publishing team. So hopefully we'll start over the next few months, see some previews and things like that.
Cool. Well, I happened to notice that on the Osprey blog, and so I thought I'd sneak that in there as a
there's a sneak peek of the cover, which I'm loving. So yeah,
cool. And so now that you started with a system, some 24-hour games, and a whole bunch of other games leading into, like, you're pretty much on a roll now with your city games, the Neon City Overdrive, Heart City, and now Tomorrow City. What advice would you give to somebody, like, it's not your full-time job, you're still doing it off the side of your desk and in your spare time, but what advice would you give to aspiring game designers that would like to do something like you've done?
So I think the key is to just buckle down and get something out there. I think get involved in game jams would be my suggestion. I haven't done a game jam in a very long time because when I write, I'm trying to finish one of the dozen projects that are looming over the top of my head. But that's what I cut my teeth on. And what it does is it requires you to finish, because I think too often you have a great idea for a game and you start and then it gets hard and then the enthusiasm peters out a little bit. So I would suggest doing things that have a deadline, or setting a deadline for yourself and making it public so that people keep you honest or that sort of thing. That really helps me, knowing I need this thing done by X. It pushes me to finish. And it's taken a long while for me to realize that it doesn't need to be perfect either, because perfection is the enemy of completion. It needs to be the best you can do, 100%, but constantly trying to go, I'll just do one more tweak. And I had to learn that working with Osprey, because otherwise, I sent them the manuscript, and then it was, actually, can I change something? And then it was like, if I ask them to change something again, they're not going to be impressed. And so I think getting something finished and sharing it with people is the first step. I can be quite an anxious individual, and so every time I put things out there, I feel that knot in my stomach of, oh my goodness, what if people hate it? Or what if I've written something, unconsciously objectionable in there, or whatever. Somebody is going to turn around eventually and say, I'm terrible at this. But the act of putting it out there, giving it a few days, some room to breathe, it lifts that anxiety. You feel better about the thing you've done, and you've got something complete. So that's my first and probably biggest piece of advice to somebody that is starting out or wants to do it themselves. There's plenty of resources online to help. So I use stock art for my personal projects, and DriveThruRPG is full of artists that provide their artwork for very low costs, and there are a bunch of other stock art websites around, so that's no problem. Affinity Publishing Suite is free or very cheap, and does everything that InDesign and Photoshop does. The barriers to entry into game design and publishing are incredibly low these days, so just have a go would be what I'd be telling everybody. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, Nathan, I just want to thank you for joining us today, sharing your history and some of the cool games that you've made, and we look forward to seeing what comes out in the future. And I'm really excited to see Tomorrow City and when that comes out. And want to say thank you for joining us.
No problem at all. It was my pleasure. I've really enjoyed the conversation.